The temperature's rising, the ice is melting. 8 countries control land in the Arctic Circle, and the race to control its natural resources and strategic waterways is just getting started. The icy expanse at the top of the world. This is the Arctic story, a story of temperatures going only one way, of geological change and geopolitical design, a place where boundaries are changing, and when the ice goes, it is easier to get what's underneath, and that means possibly economic opportunity.
Once an uninhabited icy expanse, now a focus of geopolitical tensions. Rising temperatures are causing dramatic, irreversible changes. And beneath the sea, 30% of the world's undiscovered gas and 13% of its oil. That's the equivalent of 90 billion barrels, more oil than Saudi Arabia alone. As the ice melts, borders and boundaries are being redefined, and the Arctic is opening up for business.
This executive order starts the process of opening offshore areas to job-creating energy exploration.
The US, Russia, Canada and Denmark claim their territory on the continental shelf extends far into the sea. The Russians say most of it is theirs, some 1 million square kilometers of the seabed. Vladimir Putin has appeared to suggest climate change, rather than a warning sign, would be a boon to big business. There's been a recent build-up in military hardware in the Arctic too. For the Russians, it's the largest since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Moscow has stationed more troops there, and 6 new military bases are being built. Russia also has the largest nuclear-powered icebreaker in the world, 200 meters long, and capable of breaking ice up to 3 meters thick. But despite this show of strength, a land grab doesn't seem likely.
If you're Russia in particular, what you really want is an outcome that says your sovereign rights extend over vast areas of the Arctic Ocean, including the highly symbolic North Pole. But I think we need to be careful not to engage in unnecessary hype and to warn about conflict. Thus far, everyone has been following established rules.
Any environmental fallout from drilling could be catastrophic. This oil spill in the Russian Arctic in 1994 was one of the worst of its kind. Obama put a stop to new oil and gas exploration just before he left the White House, saying the area was too fragile and too important. That decision could be reversed. The Trump administration has said it wants to start drilling again. It could pit the US and Russia against each other over their Arctic ambitions. As time passes and the Arctic thaw continues, these warmer climes at the top of the world are no longer just a question of temperature, but of oil and economics and politics and military might.
We will talk about military might or not in just a moment, but can the nations who claim parts of the Arctic set aside their economic and strategic intentions and maintain some kind of cordial relations? I hope it's cordial at the table. Joining me for Roundtable, Tim Riley, co-founder of the Arctic Advisory Group. He was Shell's Regional Government Affairs Advisor for Russia. Next to him, Alexander Nekrasov, a former advisor to the Kremlin. And to my left, Frank Hewitson, a member of the so-called Arctic 30. He was arrested by Russian authorities after he attempted to climb up a Russian drilling platform in the Arctic Sea, held in a Russian jail for 2 months. And also at today's table is The Guardian's environment correspondent, Fiona Harvey. Big welcome to all of you. Alexander Nekrasov, first of all, we talked about a military build-up there. Russia has put in more troops, it has deep-sea ports, it has more icebreakers than any other country, in fact, than all of the other countries put together. Well, what is going on?
Well, I think that what is going on is political posturing rather than specific expansion of any country. I think that Russia, the potential, the resources that Russia has in the Arctic, is all mostly coming from the Soviet days. All the icebreakers, including the nuclear ones, are all Soviet-made. Not a single one was built after the Soviet Union collapsed. And I think
Russia's running out of oil on land, isn't it?
Well, not yet, to be honest. And I think
so
that
if you're planning for the future, that could be the future. The Arctic could be the future.
You're correct, of course, because you always have to look at the future resources. But already the scientists are telling the Kremlin that it's going to be hugely expensive to drill for that and get this oil and gas. That the Russian technology is actually not fit for it. I mean, ExxonMobil and BP have been talking all these years to Russia about drilling in the Arctic, but it's not really moving.
So Frank Hewitson, Greenpeace, you climbed up the side of this rig. You were sent.
I organised it.
Okay, you were sent to prison because of this. Yeah. But Alexander Nekrasov says there's no need to worry. And with oil at what, $50 a barrel, and the amount of money it costs to go in there and explore and extract, it isn't likely that there's going to be a massive expansion of looking for minerals.
Well, I very much hope not. I think also with the sanctions, any real push into the Arctic is pretty much not going to happen. I think the Russians need a huge amount of investment to actually do it. Alexander's quite right. I don't think the technology is there in Russia. They spill more oil on land than was spilled by the Deepwater Horizon in 1 year. That happens every single year, the same amount. The infrastructure is absolutely shot to pieces. And also, Pruzlomnia, the oil rig that you mentioned, I think it was listed as Gazprom being worth $5 billion. In actual fact, the Norwegian company valued it as $1 billion. I think somewhere in there is the innate corruption that is absolutely rife throughout the Russian oil industry. And I don't really see there being much scope for it.
Do you see any need for you and other members of Greenpeace or other protest groups to have to go back and risk going to a Russian jail, which was not a pleasant experience?
It wasn't pleasant, but it was the right thing to do. I think what's happening in the Arctic is absolutely catastrophic, and it will affect the welfare of the planet for years and years to come, and I think a stance has to be made.
But Tim, I mean, I know you are pro-drilling if it's done in the right way. What is the right way when the risks of something going wrong up there are pretty high because of the weather and the difficulties in clearing it up because of where it is are pretty nigh impossible?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is the major oil companies will want to go there because the last 25% of the world's reserves are there, so there's no way they're going to avoid it. With the price of oil at the moment where it is, I think I agree with Frank, really, it's uneconomic. However, in some parts of the Arctic, and that's the point to differentiate between the North American Arctic and the European Arctic. In the European Arctic, in the Barents Sea, certainly Gazprom and companies like that have been working with Statoil. And the way they've approached it really is in terms of their risk management. They have ecosystems-based management, ocean management systems, and the Norwegians are very, very good at it. But nonetheless, it is a high-risk endeavor.
Do you see any tensions between, if not internationally between nations, but between companies because of what they're trying to do up there? I mean, Shell pulled out of its licensing not so very long ago, saying it wasn't economic. We know that Exxon's got big interests in Russia. Tillerson, who's the Secretary of State, used to be in charge of that, big friends with Russia. Do you see big tensions between?
No, I don't think the tensions are between the companies. The tensions are within the industry. In other words, the difficulties of climate, which Frank has alluded to, the technology, which has been devastated by the fact of sanctions. That has been the primary result of the sanctions in the Russian Arctic, is the likes of Schlumberger and other oil services companies that aren't allowed to operate there. The danger is that sanctions have accentuated the Sino-Russian relationship in the European Arctic. And of course, the danger there is offshore, especially in deep water, Arctic conditions, hazardous, with a very limited, experienced Chinese oil industry operating.
Okay, well, I'll ask you about China in just a moment. But if, Fiona, when it comes, I mean, you've been to see major oil disasters. I've seen the results of them in Alaska, not actually up in the Arctic, and in the Gulf of Mexico. It is hideous. What is oil exploration doing at the moment, and the retreating polar ice cap doing to the environment of the Arctic?
It's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous situation. In any oil drilling situation, you have the possibility of accident and you have the possibility of leaks, especially if things are not done with the latest technology, if things are not done perfectly. And the problem is that when you go somewhere like the Arctic, you are not just doubling and trebling, you're squaring these problems, because you are taking a pristine environment that so far has been largely untouched, although melting because of global warming, because of what we're doing elsewhere. And you're taking that environment and you're putting in one of the messiest, most dangerous, most difficult pieces of technology, which is oil drilling. You are taking the possibility of having an oil spill, which would take many, many years to dissipate, not like in the Gulf.
Alex, you talked about antiquated technology. You talked about the fact that the Russians couldn't afford to go in there, but if they do and what they're doing there, then they're doing it with equipment that isn't capable of running things safely, perhaps.
Well, I don't think that they're capable of actually doing anything, because they need modern technology. This is a very difficult environment to be operating in. And I think at the moment what we're witnessing political posturing. We're witnessing politicians arguing about the Arctic rather
So
than...
you don't think the Russians would go in? Do you think Trump, who says he wants to expand his influence up there and give more licenses, do you think he's posturing too?
Well, when I say posturing, I'm saying about accusations that Russia is spreading its influence, it's aggressive, it's, you know, militarizing the Arctic and so on. I think what Russia is keen on doing is developing this so-called northern route, which China is keen on developing as well, because China can
let's explain it. As the ice cap melts, it's easier for ships to
well,
get
yes,
through
using the icebreakers, yes, using the icebreakers. Now, can you imagine the Chinese goods traveling much shorter route from the north to Europe? That opens an enormous possibility. Now, that is what Russia is looking at the moment.
And would that, Frank, I mean, if you see massive amounts of shipping up there, would that pose a danger as much as drilling? Or?
Yeah, I think there is a very big concern about a huge increase in shipping north of the Arctic. And I think, slightly touching on the militarization, that should be, if it was ever to be opened up, an international seaway. Russia will never allow that to be an international seaway. You cannot go through the Northern Sea route without explicit permission by the Russian authorities. If you look at the Straits of Gibraltar, you look at the Dover Strait, you look at everywhere else in the world there's an international seaway, it is open to traffic. Now that will not be the case, and it is not the case now.
Well, and also the same with the United States wanting to extend its right of jurisdiction beyond the 200 miles at the moment where it goes. It's refusing to sign this United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, is it, Fiona?
That's right. We had some discussions on that last week as well at the United Nations level. Yes, I think the United States government is rather wary of things like that, but that's not just under Donald Trump. That's been going on for a long, long time.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back in history, I suppose in a sense it's why the Suez Canal was built, because it's easier then to get your goods into the Mediterranean rather than having to go around the bottom of Africa. Are we seeing a similar thing here?
But it is seasonal. At the moment, it's sort of 6 months of the year. So from a commercial point of view, from a container point of view, and from the oil and gas industry point of view, it is seasonal. However, I would say, though, that in terms of the commercialization and the globalization of the Arctic, this will take part, mainly because the Arctic Council, which consists of the 8 Arctic countries, have decided it will. So in terms of militarization, I think, to be fair to the Russians, one should point out that the Arctic Council has no powers. What it does is it appeals to an international organization.
But in that sense, it works quite well.
Yes, because what it does, for example, the Northern Sea Route, is it recognizes the dangers both environmentally and commercially, and in terms of a new world trade route. It directs the IMO to look at a code to make the place as safe as it can be. And as a result, we came out with the Polar Code just recently. Now, within the Polar Code, it says that there has to be search and rescue, there has to be oil spill response, there has to be major evacuation. But as both sides agree, both West and the Russians, the only people capable of fulfilling the requirements of the Polar Code, which has been directed by the Arctic Council, is the military. And therefore, what we have to be very careful differentiating between commercial securitization, which is part of the Polar Code, in terms of having search and rescue guys available on Franz Josef Island, East Siberia, and all the rest of it, and militarization for geopolitical reasons. Frankly, from a military point of view, the troops that are on that part of in that part of the world are absolutely insignificant. It's one strike from a fast US jet and it's all over. It's a nonsense. So there is a little bit of game playing here, as Alexander suggested, and there's some posturing. The Polar Code was designed to make passage through the Northern Sea route more safe. And as part of it, there are regulations which Russia, as a member of the Arctic Council, is determined to fulfill, including search and rescue, which means military people as the only ones that
it's
are
all
capable
very
of being
well
trained.
to talk about it this way, but when it comes to sort of creeping change, but it's quite rapid change, Fiona, I mean, you're looking at increased traffic, shipping, you're looking at drilling, you're looking at military, you're looking at new bases being put there. Who seems to give a damn about polar bears, walruses, and the indigenous people?
Well, that is the problem. You know, the Arctic is very remote. Very few people in the world have ever even been there. Very few live there. So it's quite difficult for many people to grasp. However, what we're doing to the Arctic extends far beyond militarizing it and potentially damaging it with resource extraction, because even if we don't do any of that, we're already destroying the Arctic through global warming. The Arctic is warming at a much faster rate than the rest of the planet. We're seeing a situation where the ice is retreating in summer, far, far more than we've ever seen in the past. And we are also seeing in the winter, the ice is failing to reform, because what happens is this ice, the ice cap, is made up of year upon year upon year of snow, ice being packed very carefully. When you lose that in the summer, it becomes much harder to reform in the winter, and so you get a thinning of the ice cap as well as it losing extent. And this is impossible to continue with.
We haven't arranged this way, but it appears that we have one side, one argument here, and we have one argument here. Frank, I want you to address your concerns to these two gentlemen over here about what you see as the biggest danger over the next 20 years, because everybody's pretty much agreed that things aren't going to happen up there for at least 2 decades commercially. But your concerns, then they can take them back to the people that they talk to.
Things are happening up there. Pereslomnia is pretty much the only production oil rig in the world in the Arctic. The Norwegians obviously will be pushing hard this summer. In the Barents and the Chukchi, there are still concessions that Trump could actually push into. Most of them were eradicated by Obama, but there are a few concessions in the Barents and the Chukchi Sea. And also, do not forget what's happening on land. As I alluded to earlier, the production capabilities happening up there are absolutely woeful. There is leak after leak after leak. My concern is that they will carry on pushing into the Arctic. Maybe not as much as Shell and others wanted to. They have actually retreated with a bloody nose, as far as I'm concerned.
I was just going to bring this up. I mean, Shell decided it wasn't worth doing it for commercial reasons, it said, but Greenpeace or somebody wrote on their site the day that it was announced, we did it, more than 7 million of us together, we did it. I mean, you can afford to ignore groups like them, can't you?
No, you can't. And the point is that the framework is what we really need, is an establishment where you have a sober look at this from the environmental point of view. One of the things I would point out is that some of the indigenous people are saying that their point is that the mitigation is impossible because they've been there for 10,000 years, the Inuit and the Sami people. So what they talk about is adaptation. And they're the first. You mentioned before about the Inuit on ski skidoos. They see what's coming, they don't mess around, and they change. Now, part of that mentality is that they see...
But that's a bit like saying the Native Americans had to adapt and change, and look
Not
what
as far
happened to them.
No, because what I'm saying is you have 2 tracks. You have people that are trying to mitigate and others that are trying to adapt, and they're completely different psychologies and structures and things to do.
If you don't like what we're doing, you've got to fit in somehow.
No, what I'm saying is, so therefore the result from the Sami people, for instance, in Norway, is look, the adaptation, the oil and gas industry, the mining industry, the bioresources that has been looked at is a fact of life. What we want is to adapt to the reality, and we want part of it. Now that,
in other words, we
there's
can't
more.
do anything to stop it. We've got to
Well, that's their
lump
view.
it or leave it, and we'll make the best
because
of
a
it.
lot of it is based on, as the guys have mentioned, it is based on climatic factors. It is the fastest changing rate of change is the fastest in the world in the Arctic. Therefore, that's why it's so politically important and why it's so important that science is there. The paradox of this, of course, is that the one industry that builds infrastructure, tunnels, looks at permafrost, invests in R&D, builds runways,
And spills oil.
is the oil and gas industry. I'm saying this is the paradox of it. It's interesting. So to my mind, if there is inevitability about it, and the Arctic Council has set up in 2015 the Arctic Environmental Council, so they could control globalization within the Arctic Council. But the first priority is there will be oil and gas development.
Is he talking sense or is he talking rubbish, Fiona?
I think it's very dangerous to call anything that is essentially political inevitable. There is nothing inevitable about this. This is a decision that will be made by governments and by companies, ultimately by governments, because they're the ones who regulate this.
But that's the point. That's what I'm saying. I'm neither here nor there, actually. I'm not a proponent for the oil and gas industry, but I'm saying the Arctic Council itself created the Arctic Economic Council within it, so that it could control the rate of globalization, and it stated which industries were allowed and which were not. And at the moment, the fact is, mining, bioresource, hydrocarbon is allowed. So that is political, and that is economic, and that is where we stand. Now, what I'm saying is that we need a better framework where Greenpeace and the likes can work within the Arctic Council to have an influence. In fact, they already are a permanent member of the Arctic Council.
Indeed.
Along with
It's
the
a fairly toothless body, though, to be true.
And is everybody picking on Russia about this, Alexander?
No, I think we were missing, all of us, one important point. Without political unity, understanding between governments, and nothing what we're talking about is going to happen. I mean, the environmental protection, the projects, and so on. We have a situation which some people compare to the revival of a Cold War, right? The relations,
More ways than one, but it's a
the
slightly warmer
relations
Cold
between
War.
Russia, America, the West generally, are at an all-time low. How can we talk about any cooperation, any projects, any environmental protection when there is a sort of a state of a semi-war between us, between the West and Russia? So I think the governments really need to first sort out the political differences before we
And
can
if that
move.
doesn't happen, what's going to happen then?
Well, that's the point. I would agree with Alexander here. The forum that is used to sort these problems out is the Arctic Council, whose two mandates, very clearly, are environmental protection
Frank says
and
it's
sustainable
rubbish.
development. Well, there's a degrees of rubbish. I mean, that's what it is, and that is the forum that's decided. So you have UNCLOS and you have hard science to support that. And environmental protection and sustainable development are both. The difficulty with the sanctions in the European Arctic, and I would very much differentiate here between the North American Arctic and the European Arctic, is that the sanctions have put a lot of pressure on Russia, and the worst case scenario is that Russia may say, if you're looking at NATO to move into the Arctic, that is a sovereign move. That's sovereignty, boundaries, territories, borders. The Arctic Council is based on sovereign rights, access. May I use your land? May I go across your territory? And Russia may say, actually, if we're going to go into sovereignty and Cold War, NATO-style governance of the Arctic, we're out. Now that, for the environmentalist, for industry, would be a total disaster.
Taking a look at the long term, Fiona, are you optimistic or pessimistic? I mean, okay, climate change, Trump's pulled out of that agreement, but it was a step, and it is a step with or without the United States. In terms of protection of environmentally sensitive areas, and this is the most beautiful part of the world. I had the privilege to go there in spring, I had the privilege to go there in winter when it was minus 40, and I saw the damage and I saw the incredible scenes of it. Is enough in place to protect it?
Yes, it's heartbreaking to look at the Arctic from above, because you can actually see our pollution really clearly. You can see dark streaks across the pristine white ice, and that's pollution that's been carried from all over the world that is deposited on the beautiful Arctic ice.
Should we all feel guilty about that?
We should. That is a mark that we have made on our planet that, as a species, we've never been able to make before. It's an astonishing thing, and the problem is that when we're looking at the future of the planet, what we seem to be missing here is that if we do extract all of this oil and gas, all of these fossil fuels, then what we are doing is causing more pollution that will make more dark stains in the Arctic, but we're also causing climate change.
It's not worth it, is it, Tim? It's not worth it.
Well, I think that's a debate that society has to have, and it is a close call. I mean, I think the first major or even minor disaster in the Arctic, European and North American, will mean that all industry will shut down, not just oil and gas, mining, bioresources, rare earths, all sorts of prospecting will be shut down for a generation. It is as serious as that. But on the other hand, I go back to this point about Russia. One of the unintended consequences of sanctions is that there has been a sort of turn against Russia as an expert on the Arctic. Absolutely unquestionably, the indispensable player in the Arctic is Russia. And if Russia were to leave the Arctic Council or to shut its gates for research and development on climatic environmental concerns.
Just a quick one, if I may, to you, Alexander. So no Cold War. Is that your feeling?
Well, I think that until we have this sort of simmering Cold War, I don't see any future for the Arctic in a sense that a proper development.
Thank you very much indeed. The ice may be retreating, but the Arctic remains, I think we all agree, one of the most wonderful, least spoiled parts of our planet. Can all of these players, all of the countries who claim a stake, put self-interest to one side for the sake of preserving the top of our world? This has been Roundtable with me, David Foster. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.